Okay, let's get started on finishing up chapter 9. So we're going to be talking a little bit about history here, as well as it applies to the gold standard and the problems that it brings with it, as well as the phenomena of currency collapse. Okay. So we harken back to the early portions of the textbook where we talked about history, and we talked about how Great Britain in the late 1800s, because of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, found that it was very helpful for them to sort of cut off these fixed trade partners and to try and push for free trade. Along with that was a need. If there was going to be free trade going on, then everybody needed to be able to have confidence in everybody else's currency. Hence, Great Britain led the way to a gold standard. So that was where everybody's currency, all the major powers in Western Europe, tied their currencies to gold. Okay. And so that way, no matter who you were trading with, if it was another partner that was tied to gold, then you had confidence as to, whether or not you were getting a good deal or not, whether the currency that you had and the currency that they had, whether, that was comparable. So certainly the gold standard is a fixed currency regime. We already talked about that. If you peg your currency to something, either a precious metal or to another currency, then that's a fixed regime. With that, though, comes the problems that as economics highs and lows come, as they always will, even back then, you have no way to be able to adjust the value of your currency in order to be able to inject money into your system. And so you can't save yourself. And so that's why it was really important that there had to be really close cooperation between all of those folks that were sort of free trade partners, that were leaders in Western Europe at that point in time, because they needed to come to each other's rescue. So when they started heading into a recessionary period, then they needed to get loans, very large loans, from some of the other economic powers that weren't having those problems. And they cooperated in that way in order to be able to keep this fixed gold standard money exchange regime in place. Okay, it required that kind of assistance to be able to make it work. Along the ways, the folks that were being taken care of course, were the bankers and the industrialists and the merchants and the politicians. Okay, so the ones that ended up sort of taking it on the chin were the folks that were still out in the old colonial locations, and we're trying to export commodities as well as labor. Okay, labor in the factories, labor in other locations as well. So often those folks end up getting left out in the rescues that happen, and you'll see that even to today. Okay, so let's look a little bit about what was going on in the United States during that period of time. Of course, we were on the gold standard as well. And so what we have here is that there was a strike. There was a labor unrest that sort of centered around a town called Pullman. Okay, Pullman was, I believe, it was in Illinois, and it was actually a company town that was owned by the Pullman Railroad Car Company. Okay, they created railroad cars for the, railroads were the rage back there in the late 1800s. This was how, the United States was becoming a commercial power, was through the transportation that was offered up by our country's railroads. And you may have heard of a Pullman car. It's often associated with a sleeper car these days. And so Pullman was making a lot of money creating, railroad cars of all types for these railroads and for the demand that was there. By company town, you may remember from some of your American history that some of the really large companies provided places for their workers to live, provided housing for them, as well as stores for them to be able to purchase supplies and food and those kinds of things. But often they were a racket for the company to just enrich themselves further, because the rents were over the top for the condition of the living of the dwellings, and the cost at the company store were often much higher than they could have been if they'd had the transportation and the time to be able to travel to wherever the next town was and be able to shop there. And so what Pullman did was, during the recession that happened in the 1890s in the United States, they cut the pay for these workers, okay? But they didn't cut the rents or the prices of the items that were for sale in the company stores there in the company town in Pullman. And so what's going on here is that the workers just had their, they were fed up, right? They had their fill of what Pullman was doing. The Pullman was giving them a job, but was stealing their ability to live and to live at a decent standard very efficiently. And so those employees went on strike. They ended up being joined by other large railroad unions. But that was opposed not only by Pullman, it was opposed by the governor, it was opposed by the county sheriffs. It ended up being opposed by the President of the United States, by President McKinley. And so in the aftermath of this, there was a group of unemployed workers which started off as only about 100 or so when they first left the Midwest, and by the time they made it to Washington, D.C., there were about 500 people and journalists that were part of that. And they were known as Coxey's Army because Mr. Coxey was the one who had started this. And what they were doing was they were demanding that Congress put into place some work programs to give people jobs, to give them decent pay. But, Congress and the United States government was not having weren't going to have any of it. They didn't listen to them. The marchers ended up being arrested because they trespassed on the Capitol steps. It was not a pretty portion of the story of the relationship between government and labor in the United States. So as you'll notice with the little comment that I put there, politics is politics, and often losers remain the losers, and that was the case here. There's no Cinderella story, no happy ending to this. Although, in retrospect, this was the period of time over which we eventually began to mark Labor Day in September, was to say that labor is important, and we need to remember that. Okay, so during this same period of time, there was a famous politician by the name of William Jennings Bryan, and he was a progressive politician, not a conservative at all. And these were progressive times, so the United States was interested in sort of looking at all kinds of new things. If you recall back in Chapter 8, one of those things was this new way of municipal government called a commission. And so William Jennings Bryan said that really the problem for the laborers and for the poor folks in the United States was this gold standard. That because of that, people that were at the lower end of the economic spectrum were always going to be there, and they were not going to be able to lift themselves up. And that group was going to continue to grow. And so what William Jennings Bryan said was, let's switch it to a silver standard, okay? In so doing, this would devalue the dollar, okay? If you switch from gold to silver and you don't adjust the exchange rate in a significant way, then what you're basically saying is that a dollar is worth a lot less because silver is worth less than gold, okay? And what that would do is by devaluing the dollar, then you end up having a lot more money injected into the economy. So if you increase the money supply, then that's going to help the folks that are on the poor end. And this is not just the folks in the urban areas, this was also the farmers that were struggling a lot as well. So, but of course on the other side were the folks who were very happy with the way that the gold standard was treating them, the merchants and the industrialists in the Northeast. And so they battled to keep the gold standard, and they won for the time being. It would take the beginning of it would take actually 4 years into the Great Depression before FDR would pull us off the gold standard. Perhaps a little known fact, I think it's better known than it was when I was a child, and that is that The Wizard of Oz, while it sort of masquerades as a children's book, it's actually a book, it's an allegory. It's an allegory about this time in America's history. where you have naive Americans such as Dorothy, you have farmers such as Scarecrow, you have industrial laborers such as Tin Man, and you have William Jennings Bryan, which is the Lion, okay, who, follow the yellow brick road, the gold standard, to go visit the wizard, who is actually President McKinley, and find out that the wizard is a fraud. And so therefore the yellow brick road is a fraud, and everyone's been sort of led down the primrose path. So you have floating rates from 1914 to 44, okay? This is because of the beginning of World War I, because of all the economic upheaval that came during that period of time, and we've talked about that, what happened in Europe, as European nations and their economy were just trashed by World War I and by the Great Debts and those other things, okay? And then on the heels of that, you have the Great Depression, and then on the heels of that, you have World War II. So that comprises this 30-year period from 1914 to 1944, okay? And so no one declared that they had a floating currency, but that was just the way it ended up being, because there was so much upheaval, okay? People were not too worried about trying to maintain the gold standard at this point. They were just trying to maintain their economy. And so that's why it says it was a de facto floating currency system. It wasn't a decision or a choice that somebody made. That's just the way it ended up being. Okay. And as I mentioned there, we officially left the gold standard system in '33, which was sort of late in this period. So this is a picture from Bretton Woods. Okay. That large gathering of nations that the United States hosted in New Hampshire back in 1944, and where we agreed on this new monetary system. The U.S. dollar would be the only currency fixed to gold. Okay, all the other major currencies were going to be pegged to the U.S. dollar. And while the other states could devalue, they could declare that the number of units of their currency that equals $1 could be less or more. That was highly discouraged, but they could do that on occasion if it was necessary. And so one of the reasons why Bretton Woods set up the IMF originally was not to help nations who were in drastic problems. It was to sort of oversee this monetary system, and to be there to sort of help make sure that things went correctly, and if they started to go awry, that the IMF could step in and inject some funds. That system, the Bretton Woods system, collapsed in 1973 when President Nixon made the unilateral decision to take the United States off of the gold standard. In reality, we had already left the gold standard a number of years before. We had not been maintaining gold for the amount of currency that we had in circulation for a number of years. And there were a group of folks who pretty much knew that. And so they started pressing the United States system, demanding that large amounts of currency be turned into gold. And Nixon knew exactly what was going on, and basically had one choice, which was to just, de facto, by fiat, say we are no longer on the gold standard. And at that point, everyone was just sort of tossed into a floating system, okay? Because they were all pegged to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar was now floating, so they were going to float as well. And there was no need to peg to the U.S. dollar unless they made a decision to do that. One of the reasons why there was more and more money in circulation was because President Nixon and the United States government was spending a lot of money over in Vietnam. And therefore, we just couldn't keep our commitment to $1 ounce of gold for every $35 in circulation. And so from that point forward, it's what's called a managed float system. There is some coordination between Europe and the United States and Japan and China and any other major currencies out there. So there's a loose coordination that happens. Supposedly the sort of the crux of this loose coordination is what happens between the G7 and the G20, which are the 7 richest economies in the world, along with a lot of other rising economies when you go to the G20. Okay. And so when you look at what's going on in the EU, okay, there was this decision among the European nations in the 1990s to form a regional union, which was political as well as economic. And each one of the new EU members then made a decision as to whether or not they were going to drop their own currency and they were going to adopt the new euro currency. Okay? And so it ended up being that 8 EU members ended up keeping their own currency. So when you're going to hear about the EU and you're going to hear about the Eurozone, and the difference between those two are those 8 countries that kept their own currency, Britain being one of them, although they're out of the EU now. So what that means is if you're on the euro, if you're a European country and you've adopted the euro as your currency, then you no longer have a central bank that is yours within your country that determines the monetary policy for that currency, because it's not yours, it's a shared currency in the region. And so therefore it's the European Central Bank. This is the same picture that we saw at the beginning, okay, which is located in Frankfurt, Germany, but it makes the decision for all of the Eurozone nations. So this is a sort of interesting story. Okay, back in 2007, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all had significant debt. Poland and the Czech Republic did too, not as much, but they still had significant debt. Okay, and they could, at that point, they had their own currencies, and they could have kept their currencies. Or they could have just dropped the peg that they had to the euro and devalued their currencies in order to be able to deal with their debt, okay, and with the recession. But they decided not to, okay? They decided to stay pegged, which ended up causing them a lot of financial pain. There was a lot of people that suffered. You know, it took them a while to dig themselves out of that hole. But what they ended up being able to do was to later adopt the euro, because they'd stayed pegged to the euro, okay? And the European Central Bank was looking for countries that were going to be able to maintain fiscal discipline. Okay, the Poles and the Czechs unpegged their currency from the euro and then devalued in order to be able to deal with their recessionary times, their economic difficulties. And so the Poles and the Czechs have not been permitted to go to the euro as a result. So here's the picture. So you can see the original member countries. This is for the Eurozone. This is not for the EU. And so you can see the original member countries that are in the orange, and then the yellowish-orange colors are those that have been permitted to join between 2001 and 2018. And you can see that Poland and Czech right there to the east of Germany, the Czech Republic, have not been permitted to join. Okay. So, you know, this shows yet another potential impact of your choice of exchange regimes and behavior, you know, and that may be, yeah, my daughter's doing the dishes. I appreciate that. So, and that is, you know, your admission or your non-admission to, you know, to political groups, clubs, organizations, right? Okay, so what is a currency collapse? Okay, a currency collapse is when the rest of the world no longer feels like your exchange rate commitments are worth anything. Okay, they feel that the way that you've been handling your currency has been really sloppy, and that they cannot trust that your currency is worth what you say that it's worth. Okay, so an example of not a true currency collapse, but of behavior that could have led to a currency collapse was the U.S. in 1973. Okay, that period when we were talking about when the U.S. was spending and spending and spending on Vietnam, and actually in the background was not keeping its gold reserves It was not increasing its gold reserves to match the amount of currency that it had in circulation, okay, which it was supposed to have been doing. And so that ended up exacting a cost, right? It would have cost a whole lot for us to have caught up with the gold reserves, but it was going to cost us in another way, okay? So as investors began to sell their dollars for other currency, then what ended up happening is sort of this mad rush, okay, where it began to plummet. Our currency value began to plummet, and so he had to either cut the Vietnam spending, Nixon that is, or he had to say we're no longer tied to gold, okay. And of course, he ended up deciding to take us off the gold standard. What that ended up doing, of course, was now he had the autonomy to do with what he needed to with respect to the monetary policy, right? And so at that point in time, the Fed was not independent from the U.S. government. It was much more closely tied. And so the government had a much bigger say as to what the Fed was going to do with respect to the money supply. So when you have currency devaluations, who ends up winning when it comes to domestic interests? Okay, well, it's going to help manufacturers, it's going to help workers, it's going to help farmers, because why? The price of exports are going to be reduced. The exports from that country are going to be reduced in foreign currency, okay? So exports are going to end up being a better deal. We talked about that earlier. Who ends up losing among the domestic interests when you have currency devaluations? Well, consumers end up losing purchasing power, okay, because that means imported goods are going to end up being more expensive in our currency. And you also have international borrowers, okay, international borrowers that have borrowed in a foreign currency, not in a dollar currency, so that they end up owing more. I don't know if this is ever the case in the United States, but this next slide has got a very interesting case in it. Okay, so you had Argentina. Mass protests erupted in Argentina when the government got itself into such a mess that they ended up taking the peso and unpegging it from the dollar, Argentinian peso, and they unpegged it from the dollar and greatly devalued it. Okay. Because it had been causing huge amounts of inflation and there was all kinds of unrest, and so that ended up leading this terrible hardship, leading to this terrible set of circumstances for the ordinary folks. Okay, it did this to save the business and the bankers, but knowing that the folks at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum were going to end up paying the price. So one of the problems for these people is evidently they could get a mortgage and they could get it valued in dollars, okay? Because at that point the Argentinian peso was pegged to the dollar. And so they could get a mortgage for a house in Argentina that was somehow denominated in dollars. And so when they're after the peso was devaluated, then what that meant was instead of, say if it was 1 peso to $1 beforehand, and now it's going to be 3 pesos to $1 because the pesos have been devaluated, then that would have ended up tripling the mortgage, the debt, okay? Because all of a sudden in pesos, which is what they would pay it in, or even if they paid it in dollars, in order to exchange pesos to dollars, they now took 3 times as many pesos to be able to equal a dollar, okay? Just as an example. When currency is in trouble, the currency speculator sharks, or vultures as you might call them, began to smell blood in the water and they began to circle and to attack. Okay, so what ends up happening is this sort of downward spiral, because as more and more investors sell off the collapsing currency as it continues to drop in value, then they're going to try and get in there and get whatever price they can for it before it becomes worthless or near worthless. And so they're able to play this in such a way so that they can make a lot of money along the way. Okay, so there's an example about a Thai bank on page 418 in the textbook that does a really good job of explaining this. Okay, and I encourage you to take a look at it. It sort of opened my eyes as to how this ends up being done. And there are a lot of other examples since the 1990s or so. Currency collapse is one of those reasons why the IMF and regional currency agreements like the EU are there, okay, to try and stave off those kinds of things. Both the IMF and, if you're a Eurozone member, the EU can help to stabilize currencies and arrange bailouts, okay? Especially if you are a currency that's pegged to the EU or pegged to the dollar as well. And but of course there's costs. We've already talked about that in Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. There's costs associated with getting help from the IMF and from the EU. Greece knows this very well. Portugal knows this very well. And that is that they're going to, demand austerity measures to try and say, hey, we're going to help you this time, but you got to make sure you don't get into this trouble again. And so you have all kinds of cuts to benefits, cuts to public goods, cuts to government salaries and to government pensions, and that makes a whole lot of people very, very angry. Okay, so citizens riot and sometimes governments fall. So it's something that you have to think about carefully before you end up accepting that help. Okay, so in sum, monetary policy is something that we don't often think very much about. I know that I don't, but it really does have some potentially really big effects on not just international economic relations, but domestic economics and all the way down to the lowest level. So it's still a bit of a mystery to me how these currency values, how the market ends up determining the value of these different currencies. Okay, like the book says, it's a product of the interaction between the country's policies and how trustworthy they are. One sort of commentary here is in the past decade or so, there have been times when the U.S. Congress has come up, really, really close to allowing the United States to default on its loans because it refused to raise the debt ceiling. And to me, that's playing with not just fire, but you're playing with a hydrogen bomb there. Economically, because if we default on loans, I mean, what is it that's holding up the value of the dollar these days, except for the fact that the United States is one of the best records, I think the best record of paying off its debts. Okay, sure, we go into a lot of debt, but we make payments every time, and so that's why people are willing to buy our debt. And if all of a sudden we are not willing, or we're not willing to sort of maintain that pristine picture of, hey, we're a great investment if you want to buy some of our debt, then that's going to hold all kinds of problems for us in the future. So to me, that's stupidity with all capital letters. Okay, we also understand that monetary policies, there's no silver bullet. In fact, it's not a silver bullet, it's a double-edged sword. By cutting, you can't just cut one way without cutting another. And while it may be good in one direction, it's going to have a bad effect in another direction. So, such as benefiting exports only to hurt imports, benefiting bankers only to hurt the common folks. And so that's how you end up seeing governments make decisions that often favor the bankers and end up not favoring the common folks, okay, which creates conflict. And if that conflict is allowed to grow and is not mitigated or soothed with other policies, then you could end up having a situation where, that government ends up being overthrown, being replaced with something else. And this idea that we do have international institutions that are there to help, okay, but sometimes the price of that help is pretty steep, and once again, it doesn't fall on the politicians and the economically well-off. It falls on the folks at the bottom of the chain. Okay, so I hope that this has been helpful, and I'll see you again soon when we start up Chapter 10. Thanks.